After World War I, people longed for peace. The League of Nations offered hope, and cities began to rebuild. But old tensions lingered. The Treaty of Versailles left many Germans resentful and struggling. The Great Depression brought hardship everywhere. Authoritarian leaders rose, promising change. By the 1930s, hopes for lasting peace were fading. 1937 marked a turning point. Across the globe, violence was boiling over and old certainties vanished. In Europe, Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany grew more aggressive. Spain was locked in civil war. In Asia, tensions between China and Japan exploded into war. The world stood divided, anxious and armed. In the Soviet Union, fear ruled the land. Joseph Stalin saw enemies everywhere and launched the Great Purge. Soldiers, artists, and even loyal party members were arrested. Many disappeared, never to be seen again. The purge weakened the Soviet military, as experienced officers were executed or imprisoned. For many outside the Soviet Union, the true scale of the terror remained hidden for decades. Ethiopia's suffering did not end with the Italian conquest in 1936. In 1937, under occupation, life grew even harder for its people. Italian troops ruled with an iron fist. Resistance fighters, patriots who wanted their country free, were hunted down and punished. Civilians bore the brunt of the occupation. Entire villages were burned in retaliation for attacks on Italian soldiers. Families fled to the mountains, seeking safety from violence and hunger. Ancient traditions and ways of life were threatened by new rulers and foreign laws. The world watched, but did little. The League of Nations had condemned Italy's invasion, but took no real action. Ethiopia's pleas for help were met with silence. For Ethiopians, the promise of collective security was a bitter memory. This failure would echo across Africa and beyond. It showed that the world's most powerful nations might not defend the weak against aggression. Spain in 1937 was a land divided by civil war. On one side stood the Republicans, fighting for democracy and reform. On the other, the nationalists, led by General Franco and backed by fascist powers. Cities and villages became battlefields. Families and neighbours were torn apart. On April 26, 1937, the small town of Guernica was bombed from the air. German planes sent by Hitler to help Franco dropped explosives and firebombs. The attack lasted for hours. When it ended, much of the town lay in ruins. Hundreds of civilians were dead or injured. The world was shocked. News spread quickly. The bombing of Guernica became a symbol, a warning of the new terror of aerial warfare. Artists like Pablo Picasso tried to capture the horror and sadness in their work. Guernica showed that war was changing. Now civilians were targets. No one was safe from the violence in the skies. Far from Europe, Asia was also ablaze. Tensions between China and Japan had risen for years. In July 1937, a clash near the Marco Polo Bridge close to Beijing sparked a wider conflict. Soon the two nations were locked in a brutal and bloody war. Japanese forces advanced quickly. Cities fell and the fighting grew fiercer. By December, the ancient city of Nanking was captured. There, a terrible massacre began. Soldiers killed tens of thousands of civilians. Women and children suffered unspeakable violence. The world would later know this as the rape of Nanking. The suffering was immense. Refugees crowded the roads, villages were destroyed. Yet the Chinese people continued to resist, fighting for their land and survival. The war in China was not just a regional conflict. It marked the start of a struggle that would soon draw in many other nations. As violence spread in 1937, the world's great powers faced a choice. Should they act to stop the aggressors or stand aside? Many chose the latter. In London, Paris and Washington, leaders debated but did not intervene. For some, memories of the First World War's horrors were still fresh. There was a deep fear of being drawn into another terrible conflict. Others hoped that the crises would resolve themselves, or that diplomacy might still work. Some even admired the strength of the new authoritarian regimes. Meanwhile, new alliances were forming. Germany, Italy and Japan moved closer, united by shared interests and ideologies. The Soviet Union watched warily, isolated and mistrustful. The democracies of the West grew more cautious, uncertain and divided. This inaction signaled something dangerous, a world unwilling or unable to protect peace. By the end of 1937, the reality was clear. The world was no longer at peace. Each new act of aggression, unpunished, made further violence more likely. Trust in international law and cooperation faded. Ordinary people sensed the change. Newspapers spoke of war, not peace. Children learned to hide from bombs. Cities built shelters. Across continents, fear became a part of daily life. The old order was collapsing. New powers and movements rose, promising strength and glory, but delivering suffering. The voices calling for restraint grew weaker. The machinery of war, once silent, began to roar. 1937 was more than a year of violence. It was a year when the world lost faith in the systems meant to keep it safe. Looking back, 1937 stands as a warning. The hopes of the post-war years had faded, replaced by suspicion and fear. The world had drifted closer to the brink of another, even greater catastrophe. Every crisis that year, whether in the Soviet Union, Ethiopia, Spain or China, revealed the weakness of peace. Powerful nations hesitated, alliances shifted, and ordinary people paid the price. The lessons were there, but too often ignored. War did not come all at once. It crept forward, step by step, as each new outrage went unchallenged. The world's leaders, unsure and divided, failed to act until it was too late. Today, as we remember 1937, we should reflect on the fragility of peace. The choices of that year shape the decades to come. They remind us that peace is precious and must never be taken for granted.